Hi, everyone. My name is Greg, and I'll be your host, maybe even your guide here on the Visionry Presents. And as you can see, today's topic is about addiction. I'll present just the facts to help alleviate any possible misconceptions about just what addiction is, why and how it occurs, and of course, I'll try to make it as simple as possible to understand. Also, please bear with me. This is my first time presenting this information in this way. Usually it's a small group. So thank you for your patience, and let's begin. The word addiction is derived from the Latin word for enslaved by or bound to. Anyone who has struggled to overcome addiction has has tried to help someone else to do so understands why. And I started here with a little etymology, which is, for those that you are not familiar with the term, is the study of the word history of words. And yes, being enslaved by a substance or behavior makes for a very difficult life. Nextly, we'll look at the actual medical definition of the word addiction and see that it's called a primary care disease, chronic primary disease of the brain's reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits is reflected in the way an individual pathologically pursues reward and or relief by substance use or other behaviors. Now, the word chronic, when we talk about a chronic primary disease, chronic means that it's a long-lasting or a continuous disease. And because the disease is not caused by another disease, that's what denotes it as a primary disease. And the definition also includes that addiction is a disease of the brain, which is what we'll be covering during this presentation. Also included in the definition is a brief glimpse as to why addicted people behave the way that they do. Today we recognize addiction as I said, a chronic primary disease that changes both brain structure and function, which actually makes it a mental health issue. Just as cardiovascular disease damages the heart and diabetes impairs the pancreas, addiction hijacks the brain. This happens as the brain goes through the series of changes, beginning with the recognition of pleasure and ending with the drive towards compulsive behavior, which makes addiction a form of obsessive compulsive disease. The brain registers all of life's pleasures in the same way, whether they originate with a psychoactive drug, a monetary reward, a sexual encounter, or a satisfying meal. Pleasure has a distinct signature, the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is the pleasure neurotransmitter. And a neurotransmitter is a type of chemical messenger which transmits nerve signals throughout the brain. And we'll explore this a little further in the presentation. And as you can see in the last point, it talks about the brain's executive function. Because addiction affects the brain's executive function, individuals who develop an addiction may not be aware that their behavior is causing problems for themselves or others. Over time, pursuit of pleasure pleasurable effects of the substance and behavior may dominate the individual's activities. If you notice the mention of substance use and or behaviors, if you look up at the second one right here, this alludes to the fact that there are two types of addiction, which we'll discuss next. The two types of addiction include substance and or process behaviors or activities. Substance addiction includes alcoholism, substance use, and smoking. I'm sure everyone is well aware of the substance use issues in the world today, but these process and behavioral addictions seem to be well overlooked. as well as the fact that both types go hand in hand. Now, process of behavioral addiction include gambling, spending, shopping, eating, and sexual activity. Behavioral addiction is a form of addiction that involves a compulsion to repeatedly perform a rewarding, non-drug related activity, sometimes called a natural reward. Despite any negative consequences to the person's physical, mental, social, and or financial well-being, there's one of the operative words of addiction, the negative consequences. Without the negative consequences, then it wouldn't become an addiction. Scientists once believed that the experience of pleasure alone was enough to prompt people to continue seeking an addictive substance or activity. But more recent research shows that the situation is a little bit more complicated. Dopamine, which we mentioned above, the neurotransmitter, the pleasure neurotransmitter, not only contributes to the experience of pleasure, but also plays a role in learning and memory, two key elements in the transition from liking something to becoming addicted to it. Now, addiction isn't something that just happens. It's something that sneaks up on you. It subconsciously sneaks up on you until it grabs a hold of you. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation, and you'll see why. Then down below, down here, we talk about some of the most common addictions that are in the world today. So some of the most common addictions are alcohol, tobacco, drugs, gambling, shopping, sex, food, and addiction to work. In this modern day, another addiction has been added to the list. It's called being a digital junkie. Of course, it's not easy putting down the cell phone or the tablet, or maybe indulging in a video game, Facebook, or other internet activities. But, as was mentioned above, when it gets out of hand, you're on the phone, or the stove is boiling over, the kids are crying, you're on the computer, you're ignoring your spouse, your friends, or whatever. That's when things become out of hand. And talking about things getting out of hand, situations can escalate to the point where video games can kill. Now, this is actual things that have happened. People have been murdered because of online games that people play against each other, like those, they're called MMORPGs, those multiplayer online role-playing games. Well, there's been instances when another player wins or captures another's favorite weapon or such, then rage can and does occur, which leads to violence and, yes, even murder. And this has been happening. People have gone to other people's homes because of this and killed them. There is also a growing recognition that many addicts are addicted to more than one substance or process. For example, gambling and alcohol go well together, or gambling and drugs go well together. If you're at the track and you have gambling issues and you're spending the last bit of grocery money to try to make the big hit, to get that big rush of dopamine, you're probably having a few cocktails or maybe popping a few pills along with it. I don't know. It's all out there. So in the beginning, we talked a little about executive functioning. So let's take a look and see just exactly what executive functioning is. So executive functioning is a set of mental skills that helps us get things done. These skills are controlled by an area of the brain called the frontal lobe. Now let's take a look at the brain's executive functioning that was mentioned. And here's a look at where the frontal lobes are located. Of course, in the front of the brain. And I have a little diagram here. And you can see right here the frontal lobes here. And it talks about this is executive functioning. The specs. You have thinking, planning, organizing, and problem solving, emotions, behavioral control, and your personality. And you can see there's a few other things that show here what the brain is, but we don't need to get into that right now because it just will complicate things. Back to this. Not only does executive functioning help with the above, the managing time, the paying attention, the switching focus, and the multitasking, but it also helps us plan and organize. It helps us remember details. It helps us do things based on our own unique experience. And most importantly, it helps us avoid saying or doing the wrong thing. So when executive function isn't working properly as it should, our behavior is less controlled. This can affect your ability to go to work or school, maintain a relationship, or do things independently. So it's no wonder why life is disrupted when executive functioning isn't working properly due to the changes addiction exerts in the brain. And there is really no fault to the addict because once the biological brain changes occur, all bets are off. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later on too. Now, an example of executive functioning, just so that you can get a better idea, say you're at a friend's or maybe you're out having dinner and you see maybe like a piece of chocolate cake or a pie on the dessert cart or on the counter, and it may be tempting. You may want to, grab that. If you're like me, a sweet tooth, I won't pass up too much. But this is where executive functioning steps in. The organizational part of executive functioning reminds you that that slice is likely to have hundreds of calories. The regulation part of executive functioning tells you that eating the cake, excuse me, conflicts with goals you may have, like eating less sugar or losing weight. Now, let's take a look at the signs of addiction and compare to the loss of executive functioning. The most common warning signs of addiction include changes in a person's behavior, such as suddenly becoming unreliable, a lack of attention to appearance or personal hygiene, basic lifestyle patterns are altered, such as sleeping and eating. There's a loss of willpower, which leads to tolerance or escalation of use, and withdrawal symptoms upon quitting. Okay, so why are these behaviors cited? If we look closely at the list and review what executive functioning does for us and what the detrimental effects addiction has on the proper executive functioning, we can summarize why addicts act the way they do. Everything is thrown off. Their life is in an upheaval. Of course, the loss of willpower, right here, can lead to tolerance and escalation. Now, for those of you that don't know, tolerance is when you need to have more of the drug or more of the activity to produce the surge of dopamine that you need to keep yourself happy. And then one of the other operative words of addiction is withdrawal symptoms upon quitting. Without withdrawal symptoms and without the negative consequences of your actions from the addiction, then it wouldn't be called an addiction. Other changes that include physical changes such as losing weight, sores on your face, arms or legs, possibly from poor hygiene or not eating properly, issues with your dental health, nosebleeds, or a general overall disheveled appearance, and the old, like we've heard in the past, the red, bloodshot, and glassy eyes. Now that we've got some of the basics out of the way, next we'll talk about the inescapable biological reasons for addiction that make it the nasty disease that it is. But before, let's have a little segue into this. In the 1930s, when researchers first began to investigate what caused addictive behavior, they believed that people who developed addictions were somehow morally flawed or lacking in willpower. But today we know that this is not the case. And So, uh, with that said, now let's go forward and we'll take a look at those biological reasons that addiction happens. We have the brain's pleasure pathway, which is the dopamine shortcut. The brain areas involved in the biochemical connection are the nucleus accumbens, sometimes called the brain's pleasure center, the hippocampus, which stores memories, and the amygdala, which regulates emotion. And here's a little shot of the brain that shows you where those structures are. And it's in this area of the brain, which is the most primitive part of the brain, that is kind of like the pre-mammalian brain that they speak of. Now let's back up. So addictive drugs and activities provide a shortcut to the brain's reward system by flooding the nucleus accumbens, which we saw right here, which is a structure in the ancient part of the brain called the limbic system. And that's something that gets complicated, so we'll talk about that probably at another presentation. So this nucleus accumbens gets flooded with dopamine, which we've discussed about being a neurotransmitter of pleasure. Then the hippocampus lays down the memories of this rapid sense of satisfaction, and the amygdala is involved in the process of emotions such as fear, anger, and pleasure. This system has an important role in sustaining life because it links activities needed for human survival, such as eating and sex, with pleasure and reward. Now, I know that we've already talked about dopamine, but let's look at it a little bit further. It plays an important role in the reward system. Dopamine is a natural chemical in the brain that sends signals to the nucleus accumbens. The drugs or activities either mimic dopamine or cause an overproduction of it in the brain, and the more dopamine, the greater the pleasure effect. But the reason that normal actions that activate the brain's reward system, like food, sex, music, or what other things that you may find pleasurable in your life that boost your dopamine, why they don't reprogram the brain for addiction is because they produce normal levels of dopamine. Let's take a further look at these structures. So now we're talking back here, the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is a small part of the brain that is important for motivation, pleasure, and addiction, sometimes called the brain's pleasure center, as we see right here. It's also linked to the brain's pathway that causes addiction and depression. Also part of a set of neural pathways that facilitate learning new behaviors by pleasurable reinforcement. So if you have new neural pathways and you're learning a new behavior and it's pleasurable, you're going to want to keep seeking that pleasure. So I would say this is kind of akin to the old Pavlov dog. The old Pavlov dog salivate when how he taught him that he was going to give them food when the bell rang and they would salivate. That's basically on the same idea. Now, the hippocampus plays a crucial role in the formation, organization, and storage of new memories, as well as the connecting certain sensations and emotions to these memories. So if the sensation is a wonderful sensation and the emotions are great, they're going to want to have more of that. So, have you ever noticed how a particular scent or maybe a song might trigger a strong memory? It is the hippocampus that plays a role in this connection. The hippocampus is thought to be principally involved in storing long-term memories and in making those memories resistant to forgetting. Now, the last one we'll talk about down here is the amygdala. The amygdala, shown in research to perform a primary role in the processing of memory, decision-making, and emotional responses. It mediates many aspects of emotion and memory, although historically the amygdala was considered to be involved in primarily in fear and other emotions related to aversive or unpleasant stimuli. It's now known to be involved in positive emotions elicited by appetitive or rewarding stimuli. Addictive substances can release up to 10 times more dopamine than natural reward behaviors. Substance use floods neural receptors with dopamine. This causes the high associated with using drugs. After continued drug use, the human brain is unable to naturally produce normal levels of dopamine. This is where drugs take the reward system hostage. It may not take much of a substance, or maybe only a limited duration of taking a substance, to be addicted. For example, say you hurt your back, you're out hiking and you slip, or you twist your ankle, something like that, and you go to the doctor and you get prescribed, your doc prescribes you some pain meds. Today, that's kind of difficult to get because of the big opioid crisis, but still, you'll get a few. Previous to that, you'd probably get a full prescription, maybe 30 or whatever however the prescription is written. And you would take those, and you'll probably take them till they were done. But in that time that you're taking them, that release of dopamine into your brain, that starts the process of addiction. And that's something that you can't control. The only way that you can control it is by not taking a lot. Now that's why the docs are very reluctant to give opioids out or other pain meds. And I don't understand, it's not like this is something new. It's been eons that opium has been a detriment to people in the world. I mean, back in the day when in some of these other countries would have opium dens where people would go in there and never come out, they would end up dying in there. So I don't, everybody's got to pass the buck. The pharmaceutical companies say it's the doc's fault. The doc's saying it's ridiculous. So what happens is then after that, if you've taken these pills for a long enough time, the result is craving the drug and a process that will restore dopamine to normal levels. A person in this scenario is no longer capable of feeling good without the drug or process. Now, all drugs of abuse, from nicotine to heroin, cause a particularly powerful surge of dopamine. The likelihood that the use of a drug or participation in a rewarding activity will lead to addiction is directly linked to the speed at which it promotes the dopamine release, the intensity of that release, and the reliability of that release. Now, let's take a look at the factors involved in addiction. Okay. Addictive substances or activities result from the interaction of several factors. First of all, there's the drug chemistry, because some substances are more addictive than others. There's a genetic factor involved. Some people appear to be more vulnerable to addiction because their body chemistry increases their sensitivity to drugs. And it's also just as much nurture as it is nature. Causes of addictive substances or activities result from the interaction of several factors. Drug chemistry. Some substances are more addictive than others, either because they produce a rapid and intense change in mood or because they produce painful withdrawal symptoms when stopped suddenly. Now, and this is somewhere where we'll talk about the addiction factor here, but this is somewhere where the addiction factor comes in about being more sensitive to these drug chemistries. Now, with the genetic factor, some people appear to be more vulnerable to addiction because their body chemistry increases their sensitivity to drugs, especially if the substances are more addictive than usual. Some forms of substance use and dependence seem to run in families, and this may be the result of genetic predisposition. Now, could you inherit this so-called addictive personality from your parents? The answer is yes. Genetic makeup can increase the risk of substance use and/or behavioral disorders. However, it is very important to remember that many other factors impact the outcome. Just because a parent struggles with the disorder doesn't mean their child will too. Nonetheless, scientific evidence does show a relationship between what's in our DNA and how we react to mood-altering substances or activities. Studies have shown that as much as half of a person's risk of becoming addicted to drugs or activities depends upon his or her genetic makeup. It also should be noted that developing substance use disorders is much of a product of environment as it is a result of inherited traits. So peer pressure, or you see your parents using these substances, so you try it, or you try the risky behaviors, and that just leads to a road down the road to not a very good place. And research has shown that children with parents who have substance use and or behavioral issues are more likely to try these substances and or behaviors and develop an addiction. Because children whose parents exhibit these behaviors are more likely to have these behavioral problems themselves. And the children have more opportunities to try these substances and or model these learned behaviors. And a little side note here, before the 1980s, the so-called addictive personality was used to explain the development of addiction. The addictive personality was described as escapist, impulsive, dependent, devious, manipulative, and self-centered. Scientists now believe that these character traits develop in addicts as a result of the addiction, rather than the traits being a cause of the addiction. And this basically relates back to our executive functioning, and that's why people act the way they do, because their executive functioning is thrown off because of the brain changes caused by the addiction. And if you suspect a genetic influence on you, it's best to err on the side of caution and possibly stay away from substances and or those behaviors. Now, let's take a look at what can be done about the disease. Any effective treatment program should include the following. Effective treatment involves attending to physical and emotional and spiritual needs of the addict. The addict should remain in treatment for an adequate period of time to improve the chances of success. A solid aftercare program is a must. Counseling and support groups should be used as a treatment method for any type of addiction, and addiction is not a disease that one should go alone. So there are several key factors and principles that should be used as an effective treatment program. First of all, treatment should be readily available to addicts. As we spoke up here, effective treatment that involves attending to physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. Now, the physical needs, basically, that has to do with the withdrawal factor. Sometimes you get medication. Sometimes you'll be weaned off your drug or whatever that is the problem there. And emotional, and most people that have an addiction, depending on like how bad it is, can and will have emotional and spiritual, be emotionally, spiritually bankrupt. Addicts need to remain in treatment for an adequate period of time to get their chances. Not everyone will respond to treatment the same. Counseling should be used as a treatment method for any type of addiction. Medication can improve the outcome of substance use treatment. Now, I want to elaborate on this a little bit because a lot of people don't know this, but withdrawal from alcohol can kill you because of the way alcohol works on the brain. Now, depending on how much you drink and how long you've been drinking for, if you just stop drinking right off the bat and don't have any kind of medication to help your body process to get back into a normal, you'll end up with what's called the delirium tremens, the DTs. We've probably all heard of that, where people shake and they see things. The brain processes that work for this, that they just go haywire and everything gets out of control and your body can just, you will die. Drug treatment programs should assess patients for communicable diseases and teach people to modify risky behaviors. And going it alone. Addiction is not a disease to go alone. Now, sure, you've probably heard of some people say, yep, I quit that. No problem. Cold turkey. I didn't have any kind of an issue. For some people, some people can do that. And those people are few and far in between. Um, but as I said, um, it's not something that you should go alone. Uh, you need to have some kind of counseling or support groups. Like AA is a really good program for those that have alcohol issues, that are alcoholics. The thing about alcoholism is that there's a very small percentage of people that try to quit alcohol that make it. I think it's like a 13% chance of the people that do that. Um, so, have you ever wondered if you have any type of addiction? Now, let's take a look at this. Are you addicted? Determine whether you have an addiction isn't completely straightforward, and admitting it isn't easy, largely because of the stigma and the shame associated with addiction. But acknowledging the problem is the first step towards recovery. Now, one of these things that I like to say, the stigma and the shame, basically has to do that society is not caught up with the real facts about addiction and why and how it happens. It's a lot of hearsay. People say, oh, well, that's, this person doesn't have any kind of willpower. That's the way they are, and this is what happens. But now that we know that that's not the case, maybe in the future, society might say, we got to give these people a break. It's not their fault that this has happened. And then we talk about, then we go on to this part here. So if a yes answer to any of these following 3 questions suggests that you might have a problem with addiction and should, at the very least, consult a healthcare provider for further evaluation and guidance. Now, answer these questions in the privacy of your own home, in your mind, and answer them honestly for yourself and see what you think. First question, do you use the substance or engage in the behavior more often than you did in the past? Do you have withdrawal symptoms when you don't have the substance or engage in that behavior? Now, kind of like one of the little things that I like to use for this is that we all drink coffee. I'm kind of a 2 or 3 pot a day guy. And if I don't have my coffee in the morning, I can get a headache. I can start getting a little bit irritable. My girlfriend has to say, why don't you just have a cup and get it over with? Okay. And then finally, have you ever lied to anyone about your use of a substance or to the extent of your behavior? There's a million excuses out there. Some of them like, oh, I didn't drink as much as so-and-so, or, I wasn't hanging from the chandelier like, he was or she was, or when you get in that kind of position, the excuses are endless. But that's part of the addiction, and that's what you do when you're an addict. Okay, so let's take a little summary. We're pretty much at the end of our presentation for the day. So let's summarize this up. So first of all, addiction is a disease, not a character flaw, nor is it lack of willpower. It's the changes in your brain that happen because of these substances. And most people, they don't even realize until it happens. You go to your doc, you trust your doc, he gives you, some pills that take care of your pain. But he doesn't tell you if you take too many of them, you're going to have these changes in your brain and you're going to start to act up and have these other, the addictive types of behavior that go on like that. It's a mental health issue. It's not the lack of power or character flaw. And as we discussed, there are many factors to the causes. The whole nature and nurture aspect of it. So genetics plays a big role in it. If you're predisposed to, a drug or alcohol or whatever it may be, then, your chances are a lot better. So you need to err on the caution side if you're the addictive, if you're having the genetic factor involved. And then the nurture part. peer pressure. Oh, try this. We like it. You'll try it. Then, you get caught up with the wrong crowd. Then you're in court. Your life goes down the drain. There is hope for successful treatment. Treatment, it's not an easy road, but with perseverance, a return to a normal state of health is possible. Well, that's it for this installment of the Visionry. Again, I'm Greg, and if you have any questions, comments, complaints, or suggestions, you can email me at thevisionary@pm.me. Now, I use this email service that's highly secured, so nobody can get into it. It's very encrypted. I have to pay a few dollars a month for it, but I don't mind because it's really good. Keeps my intellectual property safe, and it keeps anything from anybody wants to contact me. It's safe and anonymous. Thanks for your time, and I truly hope you learned a few things to help you or another along the path to a more normalized and joyful life. Or maybe these facts have instilled some compassion for those in you have fallen prey to the brain changes that are caused by substances or processes that's out of their control. Bye for now, and hope to see you soon with my next installment of the Visionary Presents. Coming up on the Visionary Presents, we're going to talk about CBD facts. Now, we have all this hoopla going around. Everybody's CBD and this, CBD and that. Do you really know what that is? On our next show, we're going to talk about what CBDs are. We're going to learn what the differences are between hemp and marijuana, and we're going to discover the known benefits of CBD. Thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. It was a pleasure being able to present this information to you. Thanks, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye now.